History continues its winding, dramatic dance, regardless of the spirit of the age or the hearts of men. In 772, Khandravasu passed away, his heart seeming to give out, perhaps worn down by the grief he suffered in his war against the rebellious Turks, who murdered his father. As such, his son, Baro-Sarvan Hagamasha Agarid, ascended to the throne. Hagamasha was a man fascinated with the trappings of civilization, its architecture, its coinage, and its systems of international trade. As such, he set up permanent residence in Taganrog, the capital of Scythia, declining to take any time on the steppe, as had been the tradition and desire of the men who came before him. He became quite close with the Rizvidite clan, alongside whom he charted plans for Scythia to become distinctly more settled. Namely, he began the construction of what he termed the Dvir Zava, or the Doorway of Gold. This was a grand market with the facilities for currency exchange, loans, and space for hundreds, if not thousands, of merchants, featuring a massive arch which welcomes and beckons them into the city to ply their trade. In the background, Scythia would continue to lazily conquer Slavic tribes further and further north and east. However, all of this obscured the judgment of the Baro-Sarvan, who failed to see the threat posed by their southern neighbors. Parthia, which over the course of the next 15 years would grow more and more Turkic, had a dangerous man at its helm. A devout Zoroastrian, towering and intimidating in aspect, he rose above the station of all prior rulers in that land. Shah Barkamik Megalith. Though the Shah was more commonly known by another name, Adar Shah, meaning the Fire King. Adar Shah ascended to the Parthian throne early, showing promise from his youth in his work with the sword and his skill with his horsemanship. When his father died young, the courtiers moved in to attempt the throne, but he managed to rally the support of the standing army which was once loyal to his father, and even managed to personally slay several other pretenders to the office he intended to occupy. Upon his ascension, he reined in the Parthian aristocracy, forcing them to live on the footprint of his grand palace in Gurgan, in the interests of keeping an eye on them. The Adar Shah would then embark upon a lifetime of conquest with his invasion of Scythia, looking to push the horse lords back north over the Caucasus mountain. In response, the clans rallied to resist the incursion, but Hagamasha would remain in Taganrog, providing commands to take care of the problem and ensure that the trade routes remain open in the south. As such, a major Scythian warrior and member of one of the minor clans, Aryaske, was tasked with commanding and coordinating the southern defense. Adar Shah came marching north with elephants and cavalry and even chariots in which he and his commanders would ride. At the head of a huge army, he commanded their loyalty, given that they were Turkic, and he commanded their general toleration, especially in the military, where they proved themselves decidedly fanatic and useful for the sowing of discord. First, Adar Shah's plan was to send out small or medium-sized reconnaissance parties in a wide swath of territory, instructing them to pillage and terrorize the Scythians in the countryside, so the royal army would be unable to choose where to respond first. Then, once chaos was widespread, Adar Shah and his army would march in a sweeping line, one which would envelop the enemy army if they met them in the field. In his own words, "One army is easy enough to stop if you know where it is, but how about 100? This came to fruition with the Battle of Svaneti. Svaneti was one of the 3 mountain provinces that led through the Caspian Range, and established between its peaks was the Scythian army, sprawled out in the field before the pass itself. The Scythians rushed ahead to meet Adar Shah, complete with their flaming pigs to trip up his elephants. Indeed, it was a chaotic first contact, but soon enough the far edges of his army began to fold in on the Scythian cavalry, corralling them into a central kill pit. The problem only got worse when dozens of detached groups of soldiers came rushing to the site of battle for a surprise reinforcement of their position. The situation soon became hopeless, and Svaneti fell to the Fire King. In due course, over the next year, Parthia would win its prize, and Scythia would be pushed north of the Caucasus Mountains. This was a great shame placed around the neck of Hagamasha, and would follow him for the rest of his life. Indeed, he would go on to barely survive several attempts on his life. For the next 40 years, neither of these men would face each other in battle again, each focused on their own affairs. Hagamasha would obsess over his pet project, the Dvir Zava, which would indeed bring in many riches. Although, it also brought many foreigners to come and stay for an extended period in order to rest and trade in Taganrog, which was not appreciated by most Scythians. Indeed, most of them simply waited for him to die, and when he did so in 827, having fell victim to the honeyed sickness, more foreigners attended his funeral than Scythians. For all his wealth, and for all the glittering jewels which bedecked his funerary garb, they couldn't burn with him, and they were plucked from the ashes by those men he once called his friends. Meanwhile, Adar-Shah lived the life of a mythic and conquering hero. His army, consisting more and more of the Turks which were loyal to him personally and not the realm, struck out in all directions. After his first victory against Scythia, he mopped up the remnants of the Nagahi, going from city to city and plucking up the last of the squabbling Islamic lords in that region, completing that mission by 800. His next conquest was aimed east against Amrame, and while he did not manage to conquer them in their entirety, he did cleave out a large portion of their territory for himself, forcing Amrame to refocus his efforts south into the Arabian Peninsula. After completing this work in 804, he turned west, first against Thamud, and finally against Armenia. To be fair to the conqueror, Thamud attacked him first, launching a jihad against the Zoroastrian warlord, as they called him. The Thamudi made strong initial gains, but underestimated their enemy, eventually being caught off guard by way of a naval landing on Thamud's western coast, on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula. Such outmaneuvering opened two fronts, which was one more than they could handle, thus surrendering some land in Mesopotamia as part of the peace deal in 810. Finally came Armenia. Adar-Shah sauntered to the Armenian border with a message for Emperor Barta Arantid, demanding 3 cities in the east and enough ransom to pave a road with gold between the Black and Caspian seas. Emperor Arantid, of course, refused, and thus ensued a pitched war for the next 17 years. At first, Armenia surprised the cocky Parthians, taking land all the way out to the Caspian Sea. Indeed, Emperor Barta was a well-learned strategist and had also acquired elephants of his own for his imperial army. However, with his death in battle and a subsequent outbreak of smallpox all along his supply lines, the Parthians were able to chip away at them, bit by bit, until they had pushed them back beyond Armenia's eastern border, settling with the emperor to annex a few provinces in the mountainous Far East, which is still nonetheless a victory of sorts for the Fire King. Adar-Shah of Parthia had a glorious and storied life, but his death in 827 was no more honorable than Hagamasha's. He died on account of the drink, and his liver gave out, leaving behind no legitimate heir. After his funeral, where they built a grand statue of him and immortalized his name at the royal palace, a civil war soon broke out. On the one side, there was the Persian elite, sons of the very men who had angled for his father's throne in a time of weakness, Prince Spaliris Hyperbatid Jarjum on the throne. And on the other side was the personal army of Adar-Shah, angling to put the Turco-Persian general of his forces, General Kubra Agha, on the throne, hoping that his Persian father and Turkish mother would be a point in his favor, styling him as a figure of national unity. This war would rage for quite some time, characterized by small-scale, grinding conflict. Elsewhere, the world continued to move and develop. To the east, in 840, the Indian subcontinent saw its first major upset in some time, with a great priest-king coming into his own in the Tibetan mountain kingdom of Song, named King Zimun Chodmar. His conquests by 840 included Kasa and Nabhaka, but this year marked his first major incursion into Maurya. His specific brand of Vajrayana Buddhism saw proselytism as uniquely important, viewing the perpetuation of false truths that kept people on the great wheel of suffering, samsara, as inherently evil, evil that must be destroyed in order to make way for the light of the Buddha. That is how he justified his warfare, and he found fertile grounds to rage against the Hindus of the Maurya, with their countless gods and their wife burning. The Mauryans resisted him well, even in their diminished state, with a variety of impressive last stands. But when Samrat Haridev Narayan Maurya fell in battle, leaving behind nothing but daughters, the throne passed to a cousin, and the morale was completely broken, Song coming to completely dominate northern India by 846. The mass introduction of Buddhism to the region completely transformed it, in a way that was much more thorough and absolute than the bizarre syncretism going on over in neighboring Atavia. In Song, Hindu temples and holy sites were burned with fire, and their foundations broken into small stones for meditative gardens. Giant standing Buddhas began to be erected all across the land at this time, which were hollow and housed entire communities of monks within their sacred walls. This sent a shudder down the continent. In Buddhist Atavia, the Hindu majority rose up in riots that would set the entire country ablaze, led by a folk hero named Arjun Das. It was said that he was born clutching 2 orange threads straight from his mother's womb, one in his hand and one betwixt his toes. Hindu faithful came to interpret this, after he gained his reputation as a famed rebel against Atavian power, as meaning the thread in his hand represented the ancient faith of Hinduism, which he defended and championed, while the thread betwixt his feet represented Buddhism, which he would come to trample upon and vanquish. Maurya, meanwhile, was now left with 3 entirely isolated pockets of territory, and grappled with a succession crisis in the midst of their partition. Then, in Pattaya, they erected bulwarks and battlements all along their northern border, hunkering down and preparing for the arrival of the Tibetan foe. More time passed, with the Dahe conquering the Bactrian kingdom in 853, and Scythia pursuing further expansion into Slavic lands to their northeast, soon thereafter pursuing a policy of Scythianization under Barosarvan Asforugos Agarit. In 860, the Parthian civil war ended, and a nephew of the Turco-Persian general, named Ulku Akbar, was crowned as Shah. One interesting fact concerning his coronation is that, despite the Zoroastrian heathenry of his uncle's famous lord, Adur-Shah, Ulku Akbar was a Muslim, and indeed, most of the Turks in his great army were Muslim as well, following the banner of Shia Islam. This would have scandalized Adur-Shah, and he would have likely killed his general's nephew if he knew, but yet the mythic Fire King was still in the hearts and minds of many, so they sanitized his image and maintained a series of implausible stories about him, ranging from the comparatively mundane tale of a supposed deathbed conversion to Islam, to the positively outlandish story of how he was visited by an angel in his youth and instructed to totally conceal his faith in the Prophet in order that his greatest general's nephew may come to Islam and rule the land after his bodily ascension to heaven, making it appear to the rest of the world that he had somehow died. The Zoroastrian fire priests bristled at this, as did many Persians who didn't want to muddle their culture with the Muslim Turks, but as it stood, a Turco-Persian Muslim had the right to rule, and his army of loyal Muslim Turks tended to take Persian wives in the interests of further blending their people into one. This would lead to enmity, with a certain segment of the Persian people refusing to even associate with the Muslim Turks and Turco-Persians, which they called bastards. Over the course of the next century, many of these exclusive Persians fled east, settling on the border with Maurya and Amrame. This resulted in a specifically Zoroastrian Persian exclave in the east, and a new Muslim Turco-Persian culture in the west, which would come to make up the ruling class. Ironically, both sides still venerated the Fire King, and both of them claimed his name for their cause. In any case, this turn of events certainly represents a seminal moment for Islam as a whole, and Shia Islam more specifically. Thamud, a Sunni caliphate, began to define themselves religiously as opponents to Parthia and their Shia heresy, resulting in the beginnings of an on and off conflict that would come to define the region for generations. Further west, in 902, A series of events kicked off that would set the stage for one of the 10th century's bloodiest conflicts. Thamud, feeling crowded in by an ascendant Parthia, decided they needed both the breathing room and the legitimacy that conquering the Levantine coast would afford them. It could close a potential front and put their backs securely to the sea, giving them one less thing to worry about, as well as potential access to better sea trade with the wider region. As such, Malik Sami ibn Arif commanded a full-scale surprise invasion of the Holy Land, controlled at present by Rhodes. Under the command of his son, Mubarak ibn Sami, he led a war of desolation and dispossession against the peoples before him. The war was successful as the Muslim forces stormed the Levantine coast, overcoming whole cities by their sheer numbers and the terror of their siege engines, ordered from far away to the east and assembled in their desert workhouses. Cities recount their walls being pulverized by great stones, and tens of thousands being carted off as slaves to the blistering heat of the Thamudi slave markets. In the first year alone, they conquered the southern half of the Holy Land and came right up to the gates of Jerusalem itself, offering their calls to prayer facing towards Mecca, away from the city they sought to conquer. Jerusalem hung in the balance, its battlements strong enough, and the invaders' siege engines damaged enough that it became a fraught, tense stalemate. It was then that Polycarpus V, Bishop of Rhodes, called the Second Crusade, targeting the Mohammedans of Thamud. In the bishopric bull he issued to call for the Second Crusade, called the Anatoliki Krisi, he declares, "Christendom has been attacked yet again, but this time we face an especially savage and perfidious foe. Islam is a false light that has led an entire race of man astray, their illiterate false prophet urging them on from the grave. As such, we call on all the nations that count themselves among the faithful of the Church, and therefore the body of Christ, to defend it unto death. Death, which we should fear not, for we march beneath the banner of the God that trampled down death by death and stole the potency of the grave out from its bitter depths by way of the Holy Cross. Furthermore, all who carry out this sacred defense with honor and fortitude will receive remission of sins from the seat of the Holy Office itself. God wills it. O Theos Totale." Now, from Thamud's perspective, this was an outsized response. They had simply launched a secular invasion and had no intention of sparking a holy war. Unfortunately for them, that is exactly what they walked into, no matter just how long they tried to deny it. The response was strong, despite the fact that the last years of the First Crusade still smoldered on the border between Santonia and Savacia in such a way that signaled a draw. The call for the Second Crusade, however, brought armies from all of Christendom to the fight. Those who answered the call to the Second Crusade were King Drutulus Corrosion II of Santonia, King Emmanuel La Rioja of Vasconia, and King Ragnaris Ingodres of Gothonia. They summoned the full might of their armies and personally traveled at the head of them. Not only did they arrive in their untold multitudes, great ships filled with Christendom's finest knights, banners of the church fluttering in the wind, and huge golden icons glittering in the Mediterranean sunlight, but the faithful also arrived as a vast human flood, marching overland through hostile territory. Indeed, while the great Christian kings spent time mustering their men and acquiring mighty ships of war for the journey, word got out to many common folk by way of mendicant preachers and charismatic monks, frantically spreading the word as far as their legs could take them. If the accounts of those involved are to be believed, a vast mob of 250,000 commoners took up their shovels and their meat hooks and marched from continental Europe, through pagan Hellas, through hostile Macedon, and through hostile Armenia, in order to directly assault the Caliphate of Thamud themselves. The most notable leader of this movement, that would come to be called the Common Crusade, was a man from Armistia of all places, one of the rare converts of that country, tall and unkempt, with the sheepskin cloak of his people draped about his shoulders, named Kreshnik Bey Christ. He was rumored to speak the tongue of every man who heard him, and that is why so many followed him to war. This popularly believed miracle made him famous across the land. Now, it took this mob about a year to travel the distance, and every step of the way it was an immense trial. In Hellas, while they weren't outright killed, the people of the land venerated a pagan god, and so refused to do business with them. Indeed, the mighty Decina were even called up by the crown to see them out of the country as soon as possible. For a certain stretch, they were forced to march for 48 hours uninterrupted, and many of them collapsed, dead on the spot, especially the very young and very old. The Common Crusade would lay idle in northern Macedonia for some time, Brother Kreshnik spinning up tales of Macedon's great crimes against the Christians of the region, and how they snuffed out the light of the Christians in Paphlagonia. This made them feel justified in raids and banditry, which was much needed in order to feed themselves. The Common Crusade even took up shelter in villages they completely overcame by force of numbers alone. Soon, they began to encounter organized resistance from the Basileus, who sought to put them all to the sword. And so, with death nipping at their heels, suffering several thousand martyrdoms at their rear flank, they rushed through Byzantium, scrambling across the great bridges that connect Europe to Anatolia. Armenia was, perhaps, the deadliest leg of their journey. Emperor Partholan Orontin had heard of their coming, and with a great army scattered them across the land, shattering their forces and crucifying Brother Kreshnik in the capital city of Sebastia. Here, before 30,000 prisoners and slaves, he gave his final sermon between rattling breaths and bloody coughs, his words recorded by the chroniclers of the Armenian court. "Do not weep for me, O faithful. I take my seat before the throne of glory today. As I depart you, dying before I reach the promised land like Moses did, remember this. Do not forget your journey. Your goal, you must reach it at any and every cost. We, as followers of Christ, are called to suffering, and with every step we track the bleeding feet of the martyrs that came before us. This is a war that must be fought, and if you are righteous, you cannot wait for someone to fight it for you. God has given it to you." After this speech, he promptly died, and Emperor Partholan decided to kill every one of the captured faithful. As his men went about the crowds, slashing and slicing, a stampede ensued, and many of them escaped. Then, for a time, the untold thousands of Christian foreigners roamed Armenia, some of them trying to return home, some of them wandering about and preaching in tongues no locals could understand, and some of them, about 41,000, continuing their march to Thamud, in the face of death itself. This now headless peasant army would slowly wind its way through the mountains of Anatolia, until history lost track of them near the border sometime in 904. Back to the Second Crusade proper. The great Christian kings had amassed a combined army of 400,000 men, first landing in Cyprus for resupply, then in the city of Tripoli, which would come to be the base of operations for the Second Crusade. The first military movement occurred late in 904, as King Ermaniol of Vasconia struck out on his own and subdued the surrounding area in the north near Tripoli, on the Thamudi side of the border. The others scorned his impatience, but his thinking was that Tripoli was vulnerable so long as they did not control the provinces immediately surrounding it as well. As such, he conquered the rural outlands, and even overcame the regionally significant city of Homs. Homs wasn't expecting to be the subject of a major conflict, and so their meager garrison was soon overcome. The people of the city were driven out into the desert by Ermaniol, who earned the moniker of the Merciful. Indeed, King Ermaniol the Merciful would stay in the city of Homs for the remainder of the Second Crusade, carrying out his own entirely separate campaign in the north, giving the Thamudi army another front to deal with. King Drutulos II of Santonia and King Ragnaris of Gothonia, however, both set their sights on Jerusalem, and marched a great army south, supplied with the finest siege weaponry the craftsmen of Rhodes could forge, for what Rhodes lacked in numbers it made up for with skill. The twin armies came cresting over the horizon, siege towers clattering in the distance, and trebuchets rumbling far afield like a great summer storm, all headed by mobs of footmen bristling with long spears, and knights on horseback gleaming in the desert sun, horses braying and colorful shields looking like the scales of some great dragon. They approached a Jerusalem which was starving, sick, and beleaguered, but nevertheless a Jerusalem that was still standing, flying the banner of the church from the Basilica of the Holy Cross, which could be seen at the city's highest point for miles all around. The Muslim army which surrounded it, while not quite as beleaguered, were still tired, hot, and not nearly as determined to take the city. For them, this wasn't a holy war, this wasn't a jihad. So, when the Crusader armies lined up and made their charge, unfazed by the ranks of Thamudi archers, whose arrows glanced off the armor of their knights, some of their standing men fled before the battle even began. The crusading army made an interior ring around the city, pushing the invaders out and away from it, at which point the gates were opened and part of the army went inside to resupply the city, to much celebration and fanfare. Outside, as the Thamudi army failed to maintain its perimeter, the Crusaders encircled them with their cavalry and put them all to the sword, burning the piles of corpses they left behind in great bonfires that lit up the night. The holy jewel of Rhodes was made safe, and the people celebrated with a new light. Over the course of the next year, while King Drutzilus II stayed in Jerusalem with his army to help defend it and rebuild its walls, King Ragnaris ventured south to drive out the Mohammedan foe, which he would ultimately achieve by the end of 907. After several advances on the part of Thamud that would try and fail to regain a foothold in the area, Thamud would eventually agree to terms with the Crusaders, acquiescing to territorial losses in the north thanks to the conquests of Ermenjol. However, controversially, Ermenjol didn't want to relinquish this land for Rhodes, since it had never belonged to Rhodes. Instead, he claimed it for Vasconia. This strained relations between King Ermenjol the Merciful and the Bishop of Rhodes, but given the part he played in their victory, this issue was left to fester. As a result of his disastrous campaign, Malik Sami ibn Arif was assassinated at court, and after a brief civil war which resolved in 911, one particularly ambitious vassal rose to the royal position, Malik Jalil ibn Fadl Majid. Once ascendant, he changed the main title from Thamud to Syria, moving his new capital to Palmyra, right on the Vasconian border, viewing their new holdings in the region as a lost sheep separated from the flock. However, the time for war had, at least for now, passed, and the time had come for all sides to take care and rebuild. Indeed, the next 80 years would be characterized by a general stability in world affairs, with some minor shifting in European border wars, and Scythia slowly growing, bit by bit, like an ominous storm cloud on the edge of civilization. Trends which had been set in motion during the later 9th and early 10th centuries continued to consolidate, with Parthia becoming firmly Muslim and Turco-Persian, with only 10% or so remaining either purely Turkic or purely Persian, with the pure Persian Zoroastrian minority being consolidated in the eastern mountains, their strongholds in Sistan and Kabul, where the Great Fire Temples still carried out their ceremonies and still sent up their smoke to Ahura Mazda. In India, while the Hindu Maurya still held their ground, they were suffering a dark age, surrounded by hostile neighbors and cut off from most trade. Meanwhile, Pattaya had become more pluralistic, allowing tolerance for all religions within its borders, pursuing this policy as an insurance against the invading forces which might decimate their kingdom should they overcome their border defenses. Meanwhile, Rayana gradually shifted from Sunni to Shia Islam due to proximity and pressure from both Parthia and Amrame. To the north, Song and Atavia held a variety of theological summits regarding Buddhist orthodoxy, where Vajrayana and Theravada Buddhists often came to intellectual blows. Whereas the syncretic Theravada branch followed in Atavia held that true enlightenment took countless lifetimes to truly achieve, with a cast of Hindu spirits and gods in play as well, Vajrayana held that, due to new revelation, enlightenment could be attained in a single lifetime by way of rituals which centered the principle of repetition, with a wide range of spirits and magics at play that were distinctly non-Hindu. As such, their differences were irreconcilable. The gulf between them only made more impassable by way of the ethnic differences between them, with Song being an ethnically East Asian, Tibetan-speaking people group, while Atavia was populated by Hindi-speaking Sajri people, an ethnic group native to the subcontinent. Anglia also saw great expansion during this age, both against the Picts and against their successor kingdoms to Travaria, gaining a foothold in the Gallic region. Then, at the end of the 10th century, as many priests and wise men across the world had theorized and prophesied the world to end, they seemed to be vindicated as a great and terrible plague came sweeping west. The world would know the pale horse and suffer under the blinding glint of its rider's everlasting sight.